Hey, here we go. Hi, Mark. So today we're going to talk to Mark Drobnak, who is someone I met since I moved to the Seattle area, and he's a very cool, interesting guy that I've, um, earned a lot of respect from everything, just getting to know him, and I thought it would be a great person to tell us about a project that he worked on when he was in high school that I thought was actually really interesting, and it highlights, I think, what's unique about the tech career, where I don't see in other careers people do a lot of like side projects. Maybe if you're a carpenter, you might build something in your garage while you're not working, but a lot of people don't really do that kind of stuff, and I think that's something that's really cool. But Mark was involved in a very big project for many years, and I'm really excited to hear about that. So, Mark, tell us a little bit first, like about yourself. Maybe also tell us about kind of how you get interested in tech and get up to that.
Yeah. So, like Alex was saying, I'm a software engineer at Microsoft currently, and for a long time, I worked on a project called Pi-hole. It's a DNS-based ad blocker. You may have heard of it. But before that, yeah, how I got into tech. So I think the earliest time when I was, had any exposure to programming was LEGO Mindstorms. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it's basically Legos, but with a few special pieces that are like motors and sensors, and you could do some really basic programming with them by dragging little blocks around. And if you ever heard of Scratch or those visual programming languages, something like that. So I think the first time, or one of the first times I remember using it, was around Christmas time. So you have a Christmas tree, you had a little train going around the Christmas tree, and we had all these little toy cars, and we wanted the toy cars to go across the train tracks, like a normal train. But a train crossing, you would have the little bars that go up and down, and we wanted to synchronize those with the train. So when the train was coming around, the bars would go down. When it was away, bars would stay up. So yeah, we built a little sensor box that would detect when the train would be there, made the bars move with a motor, but we had to then make the logic work. So my dad is a electrical engineer. He does like embedded systems programming and design. And he kind of got us into that because he knew programming, and it was just a fun activity. So then fast forward a bunch of time. I think the next time was when I was into games, and I wanted to like create my own game, kind of like this was like middle school or something. So there were a few different technologies out, like one called Game Maker, which is at this point pretty big, but it's more of a simple, again, programming model. You can have sprites and add logic to the sprites and do all kinds of simple things. I don't think we really made any actual games out of that, but it was fun. There were books that would guide you through making games, so some more exposure that way. And then a little bit after that, I got into like actual programming, you might say, through Visual Basic and the Visual Studio, making a GUI, a Windows application. And I kind of forget why exactly I started doing that, but it was pretty fun. I think one motivation might have been my dad again did a little bit of programming in Visual Basic and Visual Studio, so he might have suggested that. But I would make stuff like little internet browsers, which was just a bunch of tabs and a little web page widget inside of each tab. Yeah, but from then on, I would eventually like keep progressing and found that I liked programming. So that kind of leads me to Pi-hole. So it was, I think, junior year of high school, and I wanted to work on a side project. So, I just kind of started searching the internet for something to do. I came across this one article about installing like a ad blocker on your network, because even now ad blockers are like per browser. You install an extension on your browser and then it just blocks stuff in the browser. But you have other things like smart TVs and mobile applications that you just can't block ads in, right? And especially mobile is a big source of advertising that you don't have a easy way to install ad blocking for. So this article was going through a lot of steps to install this ad blocker called Pi-hole. And so I went through all that, installed it. There were a bunch of steps and a bunch of manual stuff to do, because at that time the project had only been around for maybe 6 months. It was very small. There was only a few scripts written in Bash. There was one main script called gravity.sh because the project had a kind of space theme, and that one was doing most of the work of getting ad domains and putting them into this method to block them. And I'll get into how that works in a little bit, but that was how I first heard about the project Pi-hole. So yeah, just to explain what Pi-hole is, most ad blockers, even on browser, work on the premise of looking at the URL for each request, and if the URL matches certain patterns, the extension will block it. And a lot of the time, the pattern that it's looking at the most is the domain, like google.com or doubleclick.net, all these different domains. And there's a bunch of lists on the internet for ad domains, things that people have found to be hosting ads. So the idea for Pi-hole was, okay, we have all these lists. Most of the entries are just domains. So if we just gather all the lists together, only look at the domain, and then we feed all those domains to a DNS server, which resolves domain names to IP addresses. And then we tell the DNS server, okay, all these ad domains don't actually resolve like their IP address, just send them off to some like fake address. So that's preventing your web browser, or really anything that wants to talk to these ad domains, from actually reaching the ad server. So this is actually surprisingly effective, because when like a web page tries to load an ad and fails, it just assumes the network is down or something, and it just doesn't show anything. It'll show like a white box, or just not show anything at all in the place of the ad, which is what you're trying to do with ad blocking. So it was pretty cool. And I think at that time there weren't really many pieces of technology doing this. Even now, there's only a few other projects doing this, because setting it up is the real hard part. So like I said, the setup is quite complicated, at least at the time I was doing it. There was no install script and all the stuff. So it was hard to get into. You had to know a little bit about networking. Let me maybe pause there if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, I have a question. Did you know what DNS was, or were you just like, did you learn it after discovering Pi-hole?
I think at that time I did know a bit about DNS, but mostly just what I said, that it resolves domain names to IP addresses.
Okay, so you already, it sounds like you were already pretty familiar with programming enough to,
Yeah.
you ran across it, you understood what it was doing and what it was for and the benefits of it.
Yeah, I knew generally like what it was trying to do. This was junior year of high school, so I had already done a bunch of programming on my own. Like I had previously worked a bit on this Minecraft, mod. Learned a bit of networking that way. I tried to make a multiplayer pawn game, which, looking back on it, is, the code's a little crusty, but it works technically.
Nice. And what I was wondering would be, you found this project that was open source. Did you know what open source was at that point too? Like, so it sounds like you were looking for a project. What was your motivation for wanting to do a side project?
Yeah, so I was still in high school. I had some still at that time restrictions on my time for using screens and all computers and stuff. So your parents don't want you to just sit on the computer and play games all day. So I think we had like an hour or so that we were allowed to just play games. So there was a workaround though. If you're doing something like productive or educational, you should just keep using the computer. So I was looking for projects to do because I was interested in programming, but also I didn't want to like sit around and like read a book or something. I mean, that's fun, but I wanted to learn programming or work on something.
And was it all self-taught, or did you have any kind of mentors or friends that you were doing this with?
Yeah, it was mostly self-taught because I said my dad is an electrical engineer and like did some programming. And I recall like at least twice when we were literally like in middle school or younger, he would try to show us the stuff he was working on, and all I would see was like syntax highlighting and like the word if. So I had no idea what was going on, at least in terms of what he was working on. So besides like getting me interested a little bit in like programming, my dad wasn't really like a mentor figure, but I guess I had like some support that way. He knew kind of what I was getting into. But yeah, mostly self-taught. I would especially at the beginning like check out books from the library on like Visual Basic or other technologies. No one really at school that I knew was into programming, especially at that age. There was one person who was kind of into it, and like we talked a little bit, but I think he's a chemical engineer now, so he didn't continue that path. I have this one anecdote from my freshman year of high school. I had this Android tablet that I was using for a bunch of stuff. I had rooted it and put a different version of Android on and all this stuff. And I was trying to use it to run and program like in Java via command line, which you can imagine is like kind of hard. You have this little tablet interface with like all the touchscreen keyboard trying to write code. It was not a great setup, but that plus all my questions I had for the teacher in my geometry class eventually got me into AP Computer Science as a freshman, which was surprising to me. But yeah, I was trying to take the initiative to like, because I knew like I was interested in programming and I wanted to take advantage of the time I had, right? I got lucky that way. So I was trying to speed up my learning.
Yeah, it sounds good that you had. It's nice to hear that you had some level of support with what you were doing. And so tell us more about sort of the next aspect of it.
Yeah. So yeah, I had like installed Pi-hole and run it, and it was running pretty well, blocking all kinds of ads. But the thing with blocking ads, you always run into false positives, right? Something gets blocked and it's not supposed to be blocked, or you just want to allow it temporarily. But with that version of Pi-hole, like I said, it's just a bunch of scripts that you run manually via like CLI, and the whitelisting capabilities were there, but you had to manually like SSH into the device running Pi-hole and modify a text file and run the script again. So it was really not user friendly in terms of like my family, right? So if my family was like browsing the web because it was set up on our network, and then they fail to reach some domain, well, they don't really know why it fails. Eventually, they figure out it's because of Pi-hole. So then they ask me like, hey, I can't access this web page. So then I have to do all this manual work of like going in, figuring out what domain's blocked, and yeah, it was.
Pi-hole runs on an actual physical device that's part of your network?
Oh no, so yeah, some background on it. It's originally started and primarily run on Raspberry Pis, which are these tiny like single board computers. At the time, you could buy one for like $30 or something, but it's a little Linux machine, and Pi-hole is just a software that you can run on it.
Okay, yeah, so you had to just do a bunch of programming SSH into a computer just so that your parents are saying, I can't go to this website.
Yeah, pretty much. So, and if I wasn't there, they'd have to wait for me, or just do something else. So I at the time had done a little bit of work in terms of web dev, definitely not much at all. But luckily the Pi-hole web interface at the time was written in something called PHP. And it was a really bare bones web interface. It showed like 4 numbers, like the number of domains blocked and like the number of requests and a few other things. So it was really bare bones, but yeah, it was in PHP. So I had some knowledge of how to work in PHP and HTML. So I wanted to see if I could make a little website that they could input domains to whitelist like themselves in a self-serve fashion, so I wouldn't have to go in and do all these steps manually. So I made a really bare bones page for that, and it worked. And then that was cool. So I left it for a little bit, but then I thought, I could since this is an open source project, I could just polish it up a little bit and submit a PR so that other people could use this whitelist and blacklist page, since I thought it was pretty cool, and I thought other people would have the same issue. So yeah, that was my first PR to Pi-hole. I opened that halfway through, I think, my junior year of high school in 2016. Yeah, so that was how I got into the project. I made a few more PRs after that, and then I eventually got invited to the team's Slack server, like a chat server. And at the time, there were 4 people on the team, including me. So the person who started the project, the founder, and 2 other folks who had joined between him and me. But I mean, it wasn't really a team. It was I think of it as a group of interested volunteers, because no one is keeping you there. You're just kind of interested in working on this project, and do whatever amount of work you have time to do. So
how old they were compared to you?
Yeah, so like I said, I was in high school, junior at the time, and everyone else was 30s or 40s or up, I think. So a bit of an age difference, but I mean, it's the internet and open source. No one really cares. So that was also pretty cool, working on other people. Or that was also one of the first times I was working on software with other people interested in software. Like I said, no one really at my high school I knew was interested in programming. So it was hard for me to see anyone else interested in what kinds of things they were doing.
That's cool. How did you feel at this point? Was this something you were enjoying doing? Is it something you look forward to doing?
Yeah, it was. It was a project that I used every day, and it had a tangible benefit. And I knew some of the technologies, but I didn't know a lot of them. I didn't know much about networking. I didn't know much about how to do web dev, how to do a bunch of Linux stuff. But I knew enough to get started at least. And there were people who, were doing similar things and had some knowledge in other areas that I didn't. So it was really interesting project. Like in terms of like ad blocking, like the motivation behind the project. I mean, ad blocking's cool, but I'm not, a fanatic about it. Like, there are reasons for ads and they bring revenue. So really the main reason I found enjoyment was just the technology aspect of it and like working on a team.
Cool.
Let's see. So yeah, that was 2016, and I worked on Pi-hole for like almost 4 years. So there were a lot of milestones. Like I said, when I installed it the first time, there was no installer. Everything was mostly like manually set up. Web interface was really bare. So we did a bunch of stuff. We like added an installer, which is like 1,500 lines or so of bash, which if anyone's used shell scripting, it's a lot, and it has to do a lot of things on a lot of different platforms. So there's that. There's the web interface. If anyone has looked at Pi-hole, is like a lot richer. You can do a lot of things on there. There's a lot of stats. So I mostly worked on like the web interface side, but I did other stuff in other areas. A lot of other things. You could upgrade the installation now. I think before, when you wanted to upgrade, you would have to reformat your SD card with a new image. So yeah, a lot of different things. But what I found most surprising was this was probably 2 or 3 months into the project. I started getting paid a little bit. So Pi-hole, it's open source, but we had this like donation system set up. And apparently people, like to donate. So the first time I got paid, it was like $100 for some month. And then I was like, wow, that's cool. This is the first time that's ever happened to me. And then the next month it was like another $100. I'm like, oh wow, this is like gonna keep going. Interesting. And it's still like a volunteer project. I'm just like working on it because I have time and it's interesting and I'm learning. And then by the end though, like the last year or so I was in the project, it had gotten very large in terms of user base. So I was getting paid like $1,000 a month, which was a lot of money for like high schooler or college student just working on something in their free time.
That's really awesome, and I wanted to point out that Pi-hole is it's pretty big in the space. Like I did a bit of research, and if you look up on YouTube, there's like these videos with millions of views, and they're like how to set up Pi-hole, and lots of articles about it online. Was it big when you started like that, or did it get big?
No, it got big while I was there. So when I started on it, it was just a script. I just found some random article talking about how to install it. And I mean, I don't think I have numbers for like how many people were using it, but not that many. I just opened up our Reddit page, subreddit, and we have currently 154,000 members on Reddit. So that's just the people who are subscribed to the subreddit. When I was working on the project, we also had some very basic ways of like telemetry and figuring out how many people were using it, because like we didn't do active telemetry, we didn't do any real data collection without user consent. So, but we did have users reaching out to one of our endpoints to check for updates. So in that way, we could tell like how many people were reaching out and what platforms. And we had, over, I mean, this was a few years into the project, so over 100K users. At this point, it's probably multiple hundreds of thousands of users. Because it's a pretty useful tool, right? Especially when we add an installer. You just have a...
I was going to say something that stood out to me is that a lot of the contributions you mentioned, like creating an installer and the whitelisting, it makes, because the tools seem to already work technically, but a lot of people who are tinkers, the kind of person who'd go out and get a Raspberry Pi, a lot of times they're hobbyists, but also that they're not necessarily going to be able to follow these very technical stuff. So I think by making it user friendly, I would think that was one of the big factors that brought the adoption and the growth of this.
Yeah, especially now that I think back on it, most of the changes weren't. I mean, we had changes that improved a lot of functionality wise, like better whitelisting and bugs and other stuff, but a lot of it was also accessibility in terms of like the installer was huge, because now you could just run the script like one line and answer some prompts, and then hopefully by the end of that you would have a working Pi-hole installation. And then the web interface letting you view stats and do all kinds of management of blocking ads. That was also huge. Let's see. So, I had joined as like the fourth person on the team, and then a few, every once in a while someone would be contributing a lot. So we, might see if they're interested in like officially, joining the team, and that was really just adding them to our chat server. So there was someone who added this block page. So before when you would have a domain get blocked and you would go to that domain, you would get this really cryptic error on your browser saying like, unable to reach server, unable to resolve domain, something like that. And if you're not familiar with networking, and especially if you don't know that you have like a Pi-hole running, like if you're a family member, you just think like the internet's down or the server's down or something weird. So there was someone who added a block page. So especially with regular like browser extension ad blockers, when something is blocked, it tells you like this got blocked. Do you want to allow it or like something? So they did essentially that, but for Pi-hole, which is an interesting thing to do technically, because especially for like encrypted communication, you can't really like inject yourself into the encrypted communication. So sometimes it was a little janky, but it worked for the most part, and people liked that. So that person ended up joining the team and doing some stuff, and a few other people did similar things. But yeah, like I said, the web interface was written in PHP, and if anyone's worked with PHP, well, one, it can be an interesting language to work in. Like our code was not very good. Like none of us on the team were actually professional software engineers, really, or good at managing code bases. So it was, under the hood, kind of spaghetti, you might call it. And also PHP is just not very fast. So I could go a bit into the technicals of how it worked, but basically the web interface was slow to load all these graphs and all this information because it was doing a bunch of unnecessary work on every page load. And that was how it was originally written because like it works, but then optimizing that, and especially if someone wants to have a big installation or etc., it needed some work. So another community member came along and worked on a solution. They made this program that would run in the background and pre-calculate a bunch of these stats and all this kind of stuff that made the web interface go much faster. And that was a really big breakthrough in terms of the project because most of what people look at with Pi-hole is the web interface. And if it's slow, they're not too happy. So making it really fast was really cool. So that person also got added. But also around that time, I was working on my own solution. So besides the fact that we use PHP and it's slow, it was, like I said, the original script was in Bash, and Bash is not something you really want to have your program written in. It's more for like one-off scripts, which Pi-hole originally was a one-off script. and stuff like that. So making it maintainable and bug-free and especially secure with a bunch of security issues is something that's really hard to do with Bash. So I was trying to work on basically like rewriting or migrating Pi-hole to something more maintainable like Python. And that's what I worked on for probably half the time I was on Pi-hole, was like some various experiments in terms of improving performance, maintainability, like all these kinds of things you would expect from like someone working at a software company, because I was getting more and more knowledgeable about what software engineering was like from a either job perspective or best practices. So I said a lot of things. If anyone has any questions, maybe I'll pause now. Okay. Yeah, so I worked a bunch on different experiments for rewriting Pi-hole, basically. Like the first one was in Python, and everyone's like, oh, Python's cool. And Python's pretty easy to learn too. So they were enthusiastic about like rewriting Python and doing all these things. So I did some experimentation, and my goal was to, one, improve performance, but also improve maintainability. So that meant like Bash had to go, PHP also had to go. Like there's a lot of issues with it. Even William was talking about it when he had his interview. We had something in common there. So I was doing experiments with like React, Angular, Python for the backend, and I eventually reached a place where I could like start discussing like, hey, we could like start like migrating parts of the code to this, and that. But then I realized I was the only one working on this at the time. So I'm like, we should, if we're going to migrate, we should have other people contribute, right? And it's Python, so it should be easy. And people are like, yeah, we're going to work on this, but no one really contributed. So that was the first red flag, basically. So, in parallel, there was the project that someone made to improve the speed of the web interface, and that, following the theme of the project, was called FTL, for faster than light, because it was just so fast. But from my perspective, it was also a little bit of like a competitor to trying to, improve performance, because I was improving performance one way through rewriting and, redesigning. And then this project was doing it by kind of working around issues in the current code base, which was, good because it was easy to migrate to and such, but also it kind of covered up the underlying issues of using Bash and having this organizational issues. Let me skip through some of my notes.
I have a quick question there, and I think that this is maybe something unique to open source, where in open source, you're happy if people are just there giving their time and contributing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it can create these kinds of conflicts where, this member obviously did a lot of work, but then it also may not be in line with
like what the project is trying to go for.
But at the same time, like, you're in this position where you tell them, like, we don't value what you're doing, because I can imagine that's when it maybe gets a little stressful. But also, it seems also like a open source kind of a unique issue, I guess.
Yeah. So at the time I had no really idea about what like product management is or program management. But I think that's kind of what one of the issues was. There was no program management or product management, like who is saying we should go in this direction or make these decisions. One thing that I think is still around is someone at one point made a PR to the web interface because they wanted to see the temperature of their like Pi-hole, their Raspberry Pi. like to see if their Raspberry Pi was too hot or whatever. And what we should have done is said, no, we don't really want a temperature sensor on our web interface because how are they related? But we merged it. And ever since then, we've had a temperature sensor on the web interface and in various aspects of Pi-hole, which is really weird. And, but it causes also maintenance issues. Like, why do we have a temperature sensor? Well, if we ever do anything, we have to make sure it still works. Those kinds of things.
You know what? It reminds me of something where I get into using open source software like 3 or 4 years ago for the first time, and I remember installing Ubuntu, and then I found out that there's like a different file explorer app than the native one, and I installed it, and it had the weirdest feature where if you right click in like the space around where your folders and files are, what would you expect to see there? Like new file or copy and paste. It didn't have some of those ones that you would think should be there, but one of them was like insert happy face, insert an emoji, which didn't even make sense. So I remember thinking like, because it's open source, probably somebody thought it was a good idea and people didn't challenge them. But in reality, it had no place being there at all.
Yeah. No, Pi-hole grew very organically, but it started from a bash script and still being a bash script and having all these things put on top of it. Yeah, it has a lot of history, and it's hard to go back and change things because it works. So people are not motivated really to fix it. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm skipping over a lot of like history just because there's so much to talk about. But at some point, Pi-hole, like the web interface was fast enough, and there was a bunch of functionality, and we had solved enough security issues that we were pretty confident that you're not going to get like hacked if you use our web interface. So that's where I was trying to spend a lot of time on this rewrite, because like things were relatively stable. Switching over to something else would be not that hard, because like once I reach feature parity or close to it, it shouldn't be very obvious. It should just look like a major update. Like maybe some visual things change, installation might change a bit, but hopefully nothing obvious to the user. So yeah, I had worked on various like experiments, like I said, Python, but then I found out like distributing Python is not fun, not very easy. There's a lot of issues with dependencies. And also just performance-wise, having a Python-based CLI is actually really slow. You want your CLI, like your terminal commands, to be quick, and running the help command on the new CLI I made took multiple seconds just to show the help info. So I thought, that's not going to work. So I was more knowledgeable now in learning about stuff like static typing, which is used in languages like Java and Go, Rust, a lot of other ones. And I saw that a lot of the issues we were making, especially with Bash, because Bash is untyped, is just because like we make a change, we think it works, but actually it breaks some invariant somewhere else, and now we have a bug. So I thought, the best thing to do is add, rewrite this in a language and framework that would prevent a bunch of these issues from happening. And one thing I haven't talked about yet is like I've talked about a lot about like developing code for Pi-hole, but not about like supporting it. And support was probably the thing I spent the most time on. We had Reddit, like I mentioned. We had a user forum. There was Twitter. A lot of different places for people to talk about what's not working, right? And a lot of the issues people had were networking related. So I would learn a lot about networking that way and all the different ways that someone can mess up with their home network. but a lot of the issues were just things that kept happening because there was a bug or some other issue that we could fix, but it's really hard to fix because of the way everything was written. So that was also motivation for me to work on this rewrite, because if you fix all the bugs, there's nothing for people to complain about.
It also sounds like a good learning opportunity for you to see that when you're writing code, getting it to work is just, a small piece of it. If it's going to be deployed and people are going to be using it, there's going to be bugs. And if you write it in a way that's maintainable, then that's really, you're putting up work up front that will save time in the future. And I think a lot of people don't learn that until maybe they get a job. Maybe they're learning programming and they think all I have to do is build it and make it work.
Mm-hmm.
They've never had anybody else look at their code. They've never run into a big issue where they had to debug and they remember, what is this thing for? What is that thing for? I wrote 6 months ago. Was that one of the motivations when you were mentioning about like making the code more maintainable?
Yeah, like I think a lot of the code, even now, if you look at it, or at least when I was working on the project, was you could trace it back to like the first commit it was added in. Like once code was added, maybe it was edited a bit or like fixed for a bug, but it usually wasn't changed. And when we learned new things and ways of making things better, we wouldn't often go back and fix issues like that in previous like scripts and stuff like that. So there were only a few cases where we actually had to do big refactors, and that was like for performance or because of a major change, but the architecture has not really changed at all. There was one case actually where the architecture changed majorly when we added a database, because before we were doing everything based on files in the file system. Like when you have some settings in the web interface, like let's say you want to look at your CPU temperature in Fahrenheit or Celsius, that setting was just saved to a file somewhere in the custom format we wrote and then updated. So we had our very own like ad hoc way of doing things. So yeah, trying to make it more standardized and maintainable was a big motivation.
Did you have any account or personal information stored anywhere for Pi-hole?
No, we didn't require any like user registration. Nothing was. We had no server that stored information about people. We did have this one server that was used for debugging. So if you had a problem and you wanted, one of us to help debug, we would ask you to run this Pi-hole debug command. And what that would do is just go through and a bunch of steps and gather a bunch of information about your installation. So information like logs and configuration options and all that stuff. And then that would be transferred to basically a static file system that only we could access for a week or something tops, and then deleted. So that was actually really useful for debugging because you could get a huge snapshot of an installation. But besides that, we didn't store any information on our servers.
That's good, because then you don't have to worry about maybe like some kind of leak or something.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back a little bit to ask you where, somebody contributed some C code or you wanted to switch to React, and you mentioned that there was like a red flag there.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing was just like the lack of software engineering experience on the team, because there was one person who was they wrote code for a living, but they only knew one framework like .NET, and they didn't really work in a environment of heavy collaboration. It felt like they didn't really influence much of the architecture towards maintainability, but everyone else was a sysadmin or this one guy who was a physicist, and he was the best coder actually there. He was really good, but still not much experience like with product management or like maintaining and architecting software. So I was trying to change architecture and make these decisions, but no one else I found really knew how to handle that. So that was like a red flag. Like it's really hard for me to motivate and show why we should be doing this if no one understands like the value of refactoring. And then let's see, was that the one that you were talking about?
Well, yeah, I was just wondering when, when the member contributed the C program and you realized that it may not be, coherent with the other goals. Like, how are you handling those things? And it sounds like there was beginning to be some stress in the project there, maybe.
A little bit, because I was working on, like I said, these rewrites and other improvements, but then in parallel there were other approaches being taken which like were quicker and easier to integrate and like actually really good, but like more of the product management of like which approach should we take and which is better for the project, and or like what kind of steps, like that's a good first step, but maybe we should take another step to improve like more of the core issues of like architecture. Like once you get something working and people are happy, it's hard to say like why should we continue improving. Which on one hand is somewhat valid, but on the other hand we had all these support cases and security issues and such. So like in terms of security, we found it was unfortunately very common for someone to set up a file installation and then open it up to the internet. And that's not something that we really wanted people to do because, well, one thing is our web interface was expecting to be accessed over a local network. So it wasn't using like HTTPS. The web interface had a password, but the way the password was transferred was through HTTP, so it's not secured. And then also, it was just not a very secure password mechanism in the first place. Like we just double SHA-256 hash to your password, and that was the API key. So once someone had that, they could just they could reboot your device, for example. They could do a bunch of stuff. And then since it was in PHP calling bash, we had a lot of exec calls, which is basically just run this program with these arguments. And what I found out later is you don't want to just append like user input to an exec call. So let's say you were trying to whitelist a domain. We would have like the command set up to whitelist, and then we would add on the domain you want to whitelist. Okay, that works. But what happens when someone puts in their own command instead of a domain? So now you have remote code execution, because someone can run whatever the command they want on your device as root, actually. And they could, take over your device. They could enter your network. It's a really bad vulnerability. And we had a lot of those because that was how we did all of our programming in terms of vulnerabilities.
So it sounds like you had these vulnerabilities and you were aware of them, but the team didn't seem to maybe prioritize these things.
Oh no, we prioritized the security fixes, but there were a lot of them, and they kept coming because of the way that we were writing the software. Sometimes we would fix it, we would have new code. The new code might have the same issue, so we'd have to fix it again. Or there was nothing stopping someone from doing this. It's just they have to know about the issue and write it in a certain way, and then be reviewed by someone who knows, etc. So the fundamental approach of using exec to call a bash script is not something secure.
So take us to the next phase of your experience there.
Yeah. So the last, or like maybe even the most complete attempt at a rewrite I did was in Rust. So Rust is a very type safe and maintainable language with a bit of a learning curve, though. But I had, discussed this with the team because, I wanted their buy-in. And I also gave some alternatives like Go and a few other things. And, I, again, talked about all the improved, reasons for this: maintainability, type safety, security, lowering the amount of bug reports we get and all this stuff. And that's all good. They're all cool. And I'm like, okay, so I want people to start contributing to this as well. So it's not just me. And they're like, yeah, we will. We'll learn because, that's what we're going to be doing soon. So I started working on it because, bootstrapping it, getting it to a place that was bare bones and MVP. And there were a lot of technical challenges I had doing that, integrating with other parts of the project. And eventually I got to a point where I had, the whole bare bones Pi-hole software re-architected, rewritten in Rust and React, like JavaScript or TypeScript. And React especially is something that the industry uses a lot, even at that time. So I knew that people would be contributing. It would not be hard to find contributors for React. They would maybe be different contributors than what we had in PHP, because we had a lot of people who didn't know that much, but they knew some PHP or some Bash, and they would contribute. We would have to really review their code because they weren't usually software engineers, but we had that community of contributors. And then, with JavaScript and React, we'd have maybe more professional contributors, but we would still have people. Rust, though, I was learning a lot about, theory and such. So maybe Rust had the right, it did all the right things well, like type safety and stuff. But one of the things that was a downside was the learning curve and the fact that it's relatively new. So not many people know it, but I got assurances that the team would be learning it, and they liked the ideas. So I'm like, cool, let's see if this works. So yeah, when I started to try and actually integrate it, was where the team actually had to step in and help and merge things, was when things started going a bit downhill. And I have to give some context also on other things that were going on at the time. So the original founder of the project, he's a cool guy. He started it and had this idea. He didn't do as much coding, especially when other people started joining, but he would provide guidance and other stuff. And Pi-hole actually became an LLC, a company, a year or so after I joined. So we had a trademark, we had all this infrastructure, but the founder wanted to try and see if we could become a nonprofit. Just have this is a community effort. We should be a nonprofit. We can get donations from big companies as a nonprofit. But that didn't really stick. There was some more paperwork you have to do, and people are like, this is just a volunteer thing. I don't know what's going to change. So it didn't really stick. And I don't know a bunch of the details between him and the rest of the team, but eventually he decided to leave the project. And there was another person who was kind of a co-leader, co-founder, not co-founder necessarily, but co-leader, who I eventually found out had a 50% stake in the LLC. So when the founder left, he was now the owner of the company. And he was a little less happy about rewrites. He was maybe more, he helped a lot with the infrastructure. He helped with the trademarks and all this stuff, but he was more interested in having a product that worked, and he was less interested in like having it be maintainable, kind of like, you know, he didn't understand some of the points I was bringing up about like we are having all these issues because we wrote it this way. Maybe we should improve the fundamentals. And also, I eventually found out the founder, you know, was interested in all these ideas I had because, you know, rewriting fundamentals is a good thing. He was a sysadmin, but now he's a software engineer, so he understands some of the concepts now. But the new leader of the project actually had never been in favor of any of my rewrites, like, to begin with. So that was an issue, because I was trying to integrate this stuff that I had done, right? I spent a bunch of time on this. It was basically feature complete. We just needed to have a migration path.
So you rewrote all of the pretty much the whole program, all of Pi-hole and Rust and React.
Kind of. There was a major part, FTL again, which was doing all of the stat generation. And eventually we had integrated FTL with the DNS server. So it was the DNS server as well. So that was like, FTL at this point is kind of the core of Pi-hole because it's doing the real ad blocking and such. So I didn't rewrite that. I integrated with it because it was in C. It was actually really well written. Not really any point in rewriting that. It was doing well. But yeah, the web interface and some of the management around domain lists, like gravity.sh, that was rewritten. So it ended up being like an API server and a web interface that were the two main components of the rewrite.
So how did you deal with the dilemma of not having being listened to with your code being merged?
Yeah, so I tried really hard to like convince them of like why this is useful, but you know, eventually it was just clear. Like I would show, you know, I would provide links of, okay, at this point in time you said you were interested in this. At this point in time you said you would learn React and help with the project and all this stuff, and it was just kind of hand waved away, like, oh, never mind, I didn't actually like mean those things when I said them. So I mean, there was just no way for me to merge this. So I was like, why am I even like trying to merge this if no one wants to merge this? Like, I'm interested in the project because of the technical aspects and learning stuff, and I learned a lot. Integrating this rewrite with the rest of the project was a hard technical challenge and all this stuff. So I'm like, well, I learned a lot, but I can't actually like have anyone use this. So I decided I had to leave the project because there was nothing really for me to do. I could like continue providing support. I could continue like maintaining the current code base, but it was just mostly stagnating. Like nothing big was happening. There was like a few initiatives to like move some stuff to a database, but like there's nothing, no fundamental issues are being addressed. And also the rewrite I did, because the leader was so inclined towards legal stuff, it was already copyrighted by the company. So I couldn't even like use my own code and change the name, for example, because the code was already copyrighted by the Pile LLC. So it was just a toy project basically, and
I'm just wondering something. Isn't open source supposed to be, not copyrighted, not owned? What's happening there?
No, that's a big misconception, because open source just means the code is available, not necessarily that you can use it for your own purposes or say that it's yours. It's a common license. A very common license is called the MIT license, which basically lets you use the code for free. Maybe you'll have to like put a disclaimer that you're using code written by this person, for example. But there's very loose limits on that. Other ones are like GPL and such, which are a little heavier. You can use it. You have to give, disclaimer that it's open source. There's other licenses that require any modifications that you make to the project to be open sourced as well, which, some of these more restrictive licenses companies have issues with. So sometimes, especially in software, you'll see you're not allowed to use projects with certain licenses, or you have to get them reviewed. But yeah, the one that we were using, that's just licensing. Copyright is another thing. I can't say that I can't change the name of who wrote this code necessarily, and just say like, oh, this project I just made is mine, even though it was code written by someone else. It's hard to enforce that, but that's the idea.
So the leader wasn't doing anything that was out of the scope of open source projects?
Not necessarily. Nothing like illegal. We did have more. We did spend a lot more time choosing a license. I feel that was very pointed towards what we were trying to do than other projects. Most projects will just say MIT or GPL or both. We found one that was I didn't know about it before, but it was similar enough. But then let's see. So yeah, I was like, why am I still working on all this? Well, I learned a lot, and during this time, this was the period where I was going from junior year of high school to my first 2 years of college. So I was looking for internships and stuff like that, and that I think Pi-hole definitely helped, especially with my Mozilla internship. My Mozilla internship was I was working on Rust programs, like a Rust server. So that definitely helped me, doing this rewrite in Rust, because I learned a lot. Went through a lot of technical challenges, and I talked about those during my interviews, and yeah, helped me get started in that area of my career. Because a big thing that people ask you during interviews is tell me about a hard problem you had to solve, and maybe there's a harder problem that I've solved, but one that keeps coming to mind is when I had to have this C program talk to this Rust program and share memory, because I wanted to be efficient and fast. But then when you're sharing memory, there's a bunch of issues and concurrency issues, memory safety issues, lock-in that you have to think about. So I wrote a read-write lock across processes, which took a while to get right, but it was a hard technical challenge. So talking about that and those kinds of challenges during an interview is one way that interviewers determine what kind of thought process do you have when you're going through a problem, and have you gone through hard problems? So when I had figured out that I should probably move on. I still contributed a little bit. I was slowly leaving the project, and eventually we had another discussion argument thing, and I lost access to the chat server. The leader, as was his personality, would kind of passive aggressively remove me from various things I had access to over the course of 5 months. Probably as he was logging into things and realizing I was still there, he would remove me. Because a big thing, especially in internship, when you get removed that day. You lose access to email and other GitHub and stuff, but it just felt like I was just being, slowly forgotten. But by that time I had, started working on other projects. I was working on school, internships. So Yeah, it's a bit of a tragic story, I think, but it really helped my career, and I learned a lot. Like when I was taking my networking classes in college, they would always start off with what I thought were basic things, but I realized everyone else had no exposure to these ideas. So I learned a lot from that.
Go ahead, Mike.
I was wondering, what are some good resources to learn Rust since you have learned it much? I've been kind of interested in learning, but everyone points in every direction with that language right now because it's so new.
Yeah, it keeps growing. I would say the best resource is probably the book, or like the online book called Rust Programming Language. You might have been referred to it. I can give a link, but it's a very good intro to the language and the concepts. But the thing is, when asking about like how to start Rust, is the biggest question really should be like what kind of background do you have? Is if you have a background in a certain programming language, there's resources to kind of translate that knowledge. If you don't have any programming experience at all, reading the Rust book might be confusing because it doesn't talk as much about general programming concepts, more about what the language is like. So I can give a link to the Rust book though.
Awesome, yeah, that'd be great.
And also the main page. Yeah, there's a bunch of learning resources here. And then the book is here. Yeah.
So
The
Mark,
big thing people keep talking about with Rust is like the learning curve, which, I mean, I did see a bit of learning curve, but at least from like my background, I was able to onboard to it pretty well. But that's just something to keep in mind. Like if you're having issues understanding the concepts, that's probably normal. But once you do learn it, it's pretty empowering. Like I keep seeing the same concepts show up in other languages, and it makes my code better because I realize there's issues here that this language is not preventing, but I know about, and I can prevent myself because I know about these concepts.
Wow, it sounds like it could be actually just a great resource to learn that, even when coding in other languages.
Yeah. Sorry, Alice, I cut you off.
oh yeah, that's fine. I was just wondering, since you love the project, tell us about like what your experience was like after, like leading up to today.
Like in terms of Pi-hole or career?
Oh, just in terms of like what you moved on from career-wise.
Yeah. So I did a lot of stuff with Rust, just because it's a cool language, and I wanted to do my projects in it. So, and also I was in school, so I had other school projects and inspirations there. One interesting thing that I worked on actually, like for credit as like an independent study during one of my semesters, was a MIPS assembler, linker, simulator, and debugger. So MIPS is a assembly language, and the way that you don't compile assembly language, you assemble it. It's called, because it's really a direct translation to machine code. But I worked on that. I worked on some like IDE plugin, some libraries for Rust. Currently, my side project is working on this 3DS homebrew. So the Nintendo 3DS, if you might not know, is a handheld device. I have one here actually. So it's like this. It has 2 screens and a bunch of buttons and the game system. It's really old though. So it's been hacked, and you can run your own software on it. So what I'm trying to do is be able to run stream your PC games to a 3DS. and play it on the 3DS. And the challenge, though, is doing it in Rust, because you have to figure out how to compile Rust for the 3DS and then how to talk to the operating system. And yeah, that's my current project, though it's hard to find time as a full-time employee with a social life and all this other stuff. But there are some other people interested in it as a open source project. So that's been motivating as well.
And you've moved on to a career at Microsoft, and you had a few internships along the way that helped you with that.
Yeah, I actually have quite a few internships, even before Pi-hole, or well, around the time I started Pi-hole. Like in high school, I had 2 internships in high school before college, so I had a total of, I think, 5 internships, which definitely helped career-wise. And it's also kind of because I was able to get started early. I luckily knew what I was interested in, from a young age, and spent a lot of time on that. But yeah, I've been able to work on a lot of interesting projects, both at Microsoft and other places like Mozilla.
I have another question. Given your whole experience with Pi-hole, and how it took off, and you had you've been on the project for several years, what are the biggest challenges that you learned? What did you learn about yourself, and what do you think you still have left to learn based on that experience?
Besides the technical things I've learned, there's working in a team was a big thing that I learned, especially as an open source team. So the thing with open source is a lot of the times people will only work on things that interest them. And if they're not interested in something, they'll only work on it if they feel obligated, or they're being paid to work on it. So that's an interesting motivation that's different than full-time software engineering. And you basically have some people that are really good at certain areas of the project, like the block page person who joined the team. He spent a lot of time on the block page and some other things, but not as much time on the web interface. So it's sometimes hard to have. It's really hard to have someone who is knowledgeable in every part of the project. So you have to work around that. There's actually a lot of infrastructure that goes into organizing a team. We moved chat servers a bunch of times because we were trying to find one that worked. Like Slack, we don't want to have to pay for Slack because we're open source and we're poor. So then we moved to, I think we were on Discord for a week, and then we moved to something called Mattermost, which is a self-hosted Slack. But the debug server for debug logs I talked about, there was a distribution server we used for distributing binaries, a bunch of other things under the hood that we had to set up, and that was set up by the current leader of the project, the infra guy. So it's important to have someone who's doing that kind of backend work, and even trademarks. If you get into that big of a project, someone has to be able to manage the legal aspect. And then even just communicating with users. So we have a website, and we have a blog, and posting release notes, all that kind of stuff. That's a lot of organization. So a lot of the stuff in open source isn't always coding, but just making things work, making people, marketing your project a bit, or making it so people can find information about it, documenting. A lot of different things goes into it than just coding. Probably the thing I learned most, yeah, probably the technical and working on a team, especially in open source. Like there's a bunch of stuff I could talk about just about like PR review etiquette. Like how do you review a PR and not make it sound like you're critiquing the person.
What are
and
the
stuff like that.
give us some top 3 tips for that?
For PR reviews?
Yeah.
Maybe always go from the perspective of like you're helping this person improve the code and like you're on a team, not like why did you do this or this is wrong, or saying like do this without giving any motivation why you should do something different. And also somewhat using like the features of your PR tool. Like in GitHub, you can batch all of your comments together and then send them all at once. So then you're not like streaming information to this person and they're fixing it at the same time. And then on the other person's side, like the PR opener or submitter, like try to maybe batch your commits that address the comments together, so you're not streaming commits to the reviewer who's now like going commit by commit to review, but then maybe one commit changes something, and yeah, making it more of a step by step instead of small steps. But yeah, there's other people have written much more clear guidance on this in terms of blog posts and such. I remember, I don't know if I can find it, but there's one that does it pretty well.
Yeah, one of my big takeaways from your whole story is that a lot of people that I talk to will often just in an offhand comment, we should do a project, or I want to start doing this or that. And I think that your story to me really outlines that these projects involve both ups and downs, and also things that are not necessarily the fun part. Like maintainability of code is probably just like a requirement, but it's not the most fun thing to do. And it's essentially work, but the lessons you learn and the you look at the upside, and you might even get into a bunch of drama like you did a little bit. But essentially, my takeaway is think about why you're doing it. And if you can walk away from the experience knowing in advance that there's a risk of, sometimes you're going to need to do things you don't want to do. And the downsides, like, are the upsides worth it for you? And for you, I think the upsides, to me, it seems you got hundreds of hours of programming before you ever, it helped you get internships, helped you to discuss all these difficult problems, and at an early age, you learned working on a team. And I think those are invaluable. It sounds to me like by the time you get your first few internships, it's like you were a lot probably more mature and experienced. You probably also had that experience in college as well, where you were just kind of, oh, everyone else is learning this stuff for the first time. That's interesting.
Well, especially college was interesting to me because I had learned this all through self-teaching and such. So the biggest things I got out of like a CS program at college was like, what is the science, like the things that you don't learn just by doing open source, like algorithms and complexity and some other tools, like how does the CPU work. Those things you don't really think about when you're working on some bash scripts. There were some classes that were very similar to what I went through, like talking about how memory works or how networking works, but and also that my knowledge going into college was what I wanted to know and what I needed to know, not necessarily everything. So there was a lot of gaps I had to fill.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Moad, Mike, Intisar?
No questions.
Cool. Well, if there's anything else you wanted to share, Mark.
I think one thing that people don't realize is that getting into open source is not hard, actually. The hardest thing is probably just finding the time and motivation. But even your own projects that you're working on yourself, you can have them be open, and sometimes someone will come along and help with it. Like I have this project I kind of inherited from someone else in Rust. It's a library, but I did try to kind of make it like try to advertise it a bit. I like made a post about it, and some people started using it, but you may be surprised at how you can just publish something. Some people will use it, some people will open issues, and then maybe some people will be so interested that they can help, and they'll submit PRs, and then you can review them. It's pretty motivating if someone submits a PR on your project and it fixes everything, stuff like that. And then also when I was working on Pi-hole, like especially on the Rust rewrite, I actually was using a few projects a lot, and this is kind of coming from the other side of open source, that I was using this one project that someone made just because it seemed useful. It was for embedding like binary data and files into a program. So instead of reading your files from the file system at runtime, you can read them from your binary and not have to ship anything but the binary. So that's a pretty useful tool, and I was using it, but like I found ways to improve it. And what some people might not realize is it should be pretty easy to go in and submit your fixes to an upstream. A lot of the time, even at Microsoft, I see people will have an issue with a library. They'll fork it, which means like copy it, make the change, and then they won't like submit it upstream for other people to use the fix or the feature. But that's kind of like how open source works: is you find issues, you make features, and then you merge them into the upstream so that everyone else can use those features. And if a project is run pretty well, it shouldn't be hard. Like the maintainers should be happy. They might have like some, quality bar or something for you to meet, but they can also help with that.
Cool, Mark. Well, thanks so much for sharing, for joining us. And we'll end it here.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.